When I first got there, for about the first month, I very much was on holiday. I went and hiked in the rainforest. I went on I went scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef. After I'd been there about a month, I kind of hit the first big city. I hit Brisbane. And once I got to Brisbane, I decided to kind of plug in with like local activists.
I met Scott at the climate focus camp, so it was great to hear the strategies that he'd been using, particularly because the anti-war movement was really starting to gain momentum in Australia.
When I was traveling through Australia, I did a number of nonviolent civil disobedience workshops. My philosophy in doing this is deeply rooted in nonviolence, the tradition of Martin Luther King. And I talked a lot about the corporate campaign I had worked on, which was against Halliburton. There was a kind of mobilization that was going on in Sydney around a global CEO conference that was being sponsored by Steve Forbes.
Essentially, there's a whole lot of problems going on in the world today, and things like the war in Iraq, things like climate change.
I organized an action with a bunch of friends I've made in Australia at actually the KBR office in downtown Sydney, and got like media attention. We also got a lot of attention from the local police. The U.S. consulate issued a consulate warning to Americans traveling in Australia to stay away from the Forbes conference protests and the actual KBR protest in downtown Sydney. That evening, I took like an overnight kind of bus ride down to Melbourne, where I spent the next couple of weeks. In the middle of that week, I got a phone call from the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, and they asked me to come in for an interview. And I said, am I really required to come in? And she's like, no. After that, I contacted all of my activist contacts, and I contacted a lawyer from like a local like kind of legal support organization. A few days later, I was at a cafe, and it was a Saturday morning. I was actually going to do this training that I planned to do for an Australian activist community. I walked out of this cafe, go into the training, and I was surrounded by 4 Australian federal police officers and 2 Australian immigration officers. They basically told me I was being put into questioning detention.
Scott, we're going to come down. We'll be outside the custody centre. We'll see you soon.
Scott Parkin's visa has been revoked and he faces immediate deportation after receiving what the federal government describes as an adverse security assessment.
He's suspected of doing something, but what that something is hasn't been made clear to him or us.
What kind of activities has he been involved in?
Okay, to my knowledge, the activities that he's been involved in have been about peaceful protest, peaceful activism, certainly non-violent activism. That's always what he's been advocating.
Today, his supporters gathered outside a Melbourne court to protest against what they claim is political persecution of a long-time activist against the Bush administration.
The President was only too happy to have the Prime Minister as his tour guide, Mr Bush again reminding us of their close friendship. And the importance of that relationship was underlined when they got down to business, particularly on the issue of Iraq.
The Greens accused the federal government of using powers designed to combat terrorism to silence its critics.
ASIO's emergency powers, which have gone through the Parliament, opposed by the Greens, were meant to be for terrorists, not for people who are campaigning against the misdeeds of the US administration or its associates.
The Immigration Minister won't comment on individual cases, and the Attorney-General will say only that the decision was due to security concerns.
I understand that the decision was based upon a security assessment, and security assessments are not matters about which I can comment in any detail.
This is unprecedented. Scott Parkin is effectively Australia's first genuine political prisoner.
Despite not being charged with any offence, Mr Parkin has been deemed a security risk by ASIO. Immigration lawyer Julian Burnside is today calling on the federal government to reveal why it revoked US peace activist Scott Parkin's visa.
What do you think the government are playing at here? What do you think their strategy is?
I'm really not sure. It's obviously not an attempt to make themselves look good, because I think it looks scandalous. And most people, I think, are very concerned.
Getting people who are peace activists locked up, detained, and deported from countries like Australia. Cheers to John Howard for doing such a great job.
And Australian activists that I had made friends with all over the country basically rallied to my support. You know, part of this is because I had made such great connections and made great friends, and part of it was I kind of carried a message of like nonviolence. The Australian government, for their part, basically hit the media, that hit the airwaves, basically trying to argue that I had committed political violence. And there's a newspaper in Australia that's owned by Rupert Murdoch called The Australian, and at that newspaper is a reporter named Greg Sheridan who wrote an article basically claiming that I taught violence. When my supporters said where and when, they said, oh, he didn't commit it, he advocated it. And so then my supporters came back and said, where and when? And did he advocate political violence? And they said, oh, well, we don't have any proof of that. But he did advocate spirited protest. And my supporters were like, well, basically, isn't that what we're supposed to be doing?
You know, the kind of organising that he was doing is no different to what most Australian environment or anti-war activists are doing at that time, which is like running training, skilling up new activists, organising direct actions, participating in campaigns, trying to make the world a better place.